The shelter believed separating 3 frightened puppies would make them easier to adopt. But the moment the doors closed, their heartbreaking reaction stopped everyone in the room. A former Navy SEAL recognized the fear in their eyes and made a promise he might not be able to keep. What those puppies revealed next would reunite a family torn apart for decades. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, and please subscribe so you never miss another powerful story of courage, loyalty, and second chances. Cold spring rain swept across Hood River's apple orchards, turning the dirt road beside Columbia Gorge Animal Rescue into a gray ribbon of mud. The first kennel door slammed shut, and Pip folded into the far corner as though the sound had struck him. Grant Sullivan stopped beside the intake table, every muscle in his broad 44-year-old frame going still. He had short, dark brown hair, weathered light skin, blue-gray eyes, and the quiet posture of a former Navy SEAL who knew panic often made no sound. In the left kennel, Atlas threw himself against the bars, scraping with oversized paws as he searched for his brothers. In the center, Benny spun once, then rose on trembling legs. He reached one paw toward Atlas and stretched the other toward Pip. Atlas pressed back. Pip did not move. Benny strained farther until his toes brushed Pip's paw through the bars. Only then did Pip loosen. A shaky breath left him, followed by another. 3 paws remained linked across 3 cages, a fragile bridge no intake form could describe. 6 hours earlier, Grant had been standing in his kitchen when Megan Doyle called. Megan was 35, with auburn hair tied low, green eyes, freckled fair skin, and a warm voice that hardened whenever an animal needed someone to act. 3 puppies under the floor of an abandoned apple packing shed, she told him. About 8 weeks old. The owner tried reaching in, but they went deeper. Grant glanced toward the closed room of his late K-9 partner, then looked away. Send the location. The shed leaned beside an overgrown orchard, its warped boards shivering under the wind. Grant found the puppies beneath a broken section of flooring, pressed together in darkness that smelled of damp earth, rotten apples, and rust. He could have removed a board and reached for them. Instead, he sat in the mud, placed warm puppy food near the opening, and lowered his gaze. Fear, he knew, hated being cornered. Atlas emerged first. He was the largest, black and tan, with a dark mask and paws too big for his thin body. He took 2 steps, then looked back. Benny, a sable puppy with a white patch under his chin, moved only when Pip shifted behind him. Pip was the smallest pale tan around the legs, his ribs faint beneath wet fur. He watched the open world as if it were a trap. Grant waited until cold water soaked through his jeans. Atlas reached the food but would not eat. He returned to Benny, touched his muzzle, then turned toward Pip. Benny followed and pressed his nose against Pip's cheek. Grant felt the old helplessness rise inside him, the same pressure memory brought whenever it offered him a life he could no longer save. He slowed his breathing. The puppies did not need his grief, they needed his patience. Pip finally crawled forward. The 3 moved in short stages. Atlas first, Benny between them, Pip last. Every few feet, Atlas looked back while Benny checked both directions. Grant placed an open carrier beside the food. Atlas entered, then turned around. Benny stepped halfway inside but refused to continue until Pip reached him. When Pip's nose touched Benny's shoulder, all 3 climbed onto the blanket and collapsed together. At the rescue center, Megan examined them while Grant explained what he had seen. Before she could place them in one recovery pen, Richard Langley entered. Richard was 49, tall and narrow, with neatly combed brown and silver hair, pale skin, guarded hazel eyes, and the rigid calm of a man who trusted schedules more than instinct. He studied the intake cards and ordered separate kennels, photographs, and foster files. Megan's expression tightened. They're showing severe separation distress. We have 18 dogs arriving from a hoarding seizure in 72 hours, Richard replied. We need every large pen. Grant watched Pip disappear into the corner while Atlas clawed for him and Benny stretched himself between both brothers. Something cold moved beneath his ribs. Separate them now, and you may destroy the only safety they understand. Richard looked at the joined paws, but his face remained closed. Compassion does not create kennel space. He returned to the desk, signed the transfer order, and marked Atlas, Benny, and Pip for 3 different foster homes in 72 hours. Wind from the Columbia River worried the shelter's metal roof while rain and restless claws made one uneven rhythm along the kennel corridor. By 7 the next morning, Megan Doyle had begun a behavior log for Atlas, Benny, and Pip. She recorded food intake, posture, and every change she could defend with facts. Atlas paced until his paws darkened against the concrete, stopping only to press his nose through the bars for his brother's scent. Benny stood in the center kennel with his head lowered, ignoring a yellow toy against his foot. Pip lay flattened near the back wall, trembling so lightly that a hurried person might have mistaken it for breathing. His breakfast remained untouched. Grant arrived before 8 with rain shining on his canvas jacket. He read Megan's notes without speaking, but the measured columns made his anger worse. Numbers were supposed to make suffering manageable. These only gave it a cleaner shape. Atlas had paced for 43 minutes. Benny had not responded to sound, food, or touch. Pip had refused water until Megan wet her fingers and let him lick the drops. Grant shifted Benny's cage closer to the others. Megan understood and helped. When all 3 stood near enough to reach through, Benny stirred. He extended one paw toward Atlas and the other toward Pip. Atlas stopped pacing. Pip crawled forward and touched Benny's toes. Within minutes, Atlas drank. Pip accepted 3 bites of softened food, and Benny lifted his head to watch Megan. "Write that down," Grant said. Megan already had. Richard Langley entered carrying foster applications. "You are reinforcing dependency." Grant kept his voice level. "You cannot teach independence to an animal whose body believes it is dying." "They are not dying. They are panicking. Learning cannot begin there." Megan showed him the improvement after contact returned. Richard glanced at the pages. The 18 dogs from the hoarding seizure would arrive in 63 hours. 2 families had agreed to foster 1 puppy each, and a 3rd application was nearly approved. To Richard, those were solutions. To Grant, they looked like 3 doors closing in different parts of Oregon. That afternoon, Megan prepared the photography room. The white backdrop, ring light, and blue blanket looked cheerful in a way that felt dishonest. Richard wanted individual portraits before the transfers. Megan chose Benny first because he had shown the least outward resistance. The moment she placed him alone on the table, his body hardened. He did not cry. He turned left, then right, searching each empty side. Megan squeaked a toy. Benny stared past it, his eyes becoming dark windows in a house whose occupants had fled deeper inside. Grant watched from the doorway as pressure gathered behind his ribs. Years earlier, he had seen his K9 partner Mac grow silent in a military clinic, not because the dog had surrendered, but because pain had carried him somewhere Grant could not follow. The memory made him want to gather Benny against his chest. Experience stopped him. Comfort, forced too quickly, could become another kind of fear. Megan brought Atlas's carrier to the left of the table and Pip's to the right. Benny heard claws scrape plastic and turned sharply. He stretched one paw to Atlas's carrier vent, then the other toward Pip. Atlas pressed close from one side. Pip's tiny toes appeared through the opposite opening. Benny's spine softened, his breathing slowed, and his gaze returned to Megan. She raised the camera and captured him balanced between the brothers who made the room possible. Richard appeared as the shutter clicked. For an instant, something unguarded crossed his face. Recognition, perhaps, or pain too old to name. Then it vanished. "You are making separation harder," he said. "No," Megan replied. "We are documenting what is already true." Richard's control slipped. Families get separated and still have to learn how to live. Silence filled the room. Grant looked at him carefully. Richard was no longer watching Benny. His eyes rested on the carrier doors, but whatever he saw seemed far beyond them. Grant recognized the tone. Grief had one language even when people used different words. Richard straightened the papers beneath his arm and said the transfer plan would remain unchanged. By evening, fewer than 48 hours remained. Grant sat alone in the shelter office with 3 temporary foster forms before him. Taking 3 8-week-old puppies home meant vaccinations, separate training, sleepless nights, chewed furniture, and enough structure to help their bond become strength instead of a cage. It also meant opening his quiet house to noise again. Mac's room still waited behind its closed door, and Grant had arranged his life so carefully that nothing new could enter deeply enough to hurt him. From the kennel row came a brief scrape, then silence. He imagined 3 vehicles leaving in different directions, and Pip searching for a touch that would not come. Grant picked up the pen. His hand paused above the first signature line, not because he doubted the puppies, but because he feared what bringing them home might reopen in him. Then he signed his name on all 3 forms. Clouds thinned over Mount Hood, allowing pale afternoon light to slip through the rain-soaked trees surrounding Grant Sullivan's wooden house. The gravel driveway still glistened when he carried Atlas, Benny, and Pip inside in the same reinforced carrier. The house stood beyond the last row of orchards, quiet and orderly, with dark cedar walls, a broad porch, and windows facing the distant mountain. Grant had built routines into every corner of it, boots aligned beside the mudroom bench, coffee tins labeled by date, tools returned to their hooks, and no object left where memory might move it without permission. For 3 years, control had helped him live with the absence of Mac. 3 puppies destroyed that control within 11 minutes. Atlas came out first, his oversized black and tan paws landing cautiously on the living room rug. At 8 weeks old, he was already broader than his brothers, with a dark mask, alert brown eyes, and one ear trying unsuccessfully to stand upright. Benny followed after touching Atlas's hind leg. His sable coat looked almost bronze where the sunlight reached it, and the small white patch beneath his chin gave him a permanently thoughtful expression. Pip remained inside until Benny returned and pressed his nose against him. The smallest puppy finally stepped out, his pale tan legs trembling beneath a narrow body that had not yet caught up with his large ears. Grant shut the carrier door and sat on the floor, giving them room to understand the new world. Atlas inspected the coffee table, the hearth, and Grant's boots as though conducting a security sweep. Benny stayed close enough to touch him but kept turning back to check Pip. Pip moved last, measuring each unfamiliar sound before committing another paw. A truck passed on the road and his body lowered instantly. Atlas returned without being called. Benny pressed against Pip's other side. Grant watched their breathing synchronize and felt admiration mixed with unease. Their bond protected them, but protection could become a prison if fear remained in command. The house soon filled with a kind of disorder Grant had forgotten could be harmless. Atlas discovered an old gray sock beneath the reading chair and dragged it into the center of the rug with the pride of a hunter returning from battle. Benny seized the opposite end. Both puppies leaned backward, growling with such theatrical seriousness that Grant almost warned them before realizing neither intended harm. Pip considered the contest, walked between them, and sat directly on the middle of the sock. Atlas pulled. Benny pulled. Nothing moved. Pip looked from one brother to the other with mild confusion, as though their failure had nothing to do with him. A laugh escaped Grant before he could stop it. The sound felt strange in his chest, unused and slightly painful, but the puppies only blinked at him and resumed their campaign. In the kitchen, Pip placed one paw on the cold tile, recoiled, and stared accusingly at the floor. Grant laid down a folded towel, which Pip accepted with the solemn dignity of someone receiving an apology. Atlas later found the lowest shelf of the bookcase and began pulling a paperback free by its corner. Benny stood beneath it, waiting hopefully for gravity to finish the crime. Grant traded the book for a rope toy and moved the remaining volumes higher. By late afternoon, he arranged 3 separate food bowls several feet apart in the living room. Atlas ate quickly, then wandered toward the kitchen for nearly 2 minutes before turning back. Benny paused whenever either brother moved but remained at his bowl. Pip managed only 3 bites before Atlas disappeared beyond the doorway. His head lifted, his pupils widened, and the food ceased to exist. Grant did not carry Atlas back. He called softly and tapped the floor once. Atlas returned on his own, and Pip resumed eating. Grant recorded the moment in the behavior notebook Megan had sent. Atlas could tolerate brief distance. Benny could rest several feet away if both brothers remained visible. Pip still experienced absence as danger. Grant understood that reaction too well. Evening brought longer shadows into the hallway. Grant prepared a sleeping area in the living room, but the puppies refused to settle. Atlas followed a faint scent beyond the kitchen. Benny trailed him, and Pip hurried behind them, frightened more by being left than by where they were going. Grant found all 3 at the far end of the hall, facing a closed oak door. Mac's room had remained locked for 3 years. Behind it waited the German Shepherd's worn bed, stainless steel bowl, braided leash, faded collar, and the medical blanket Grant had carried home alone. He had dusted every other room, repaired every damaged hinge, and replaced a leaking window, yet he had never crossed that threshold. The door had become more than wood. It was an agreement between Grant and Grief. Neither would disturb the other as long as it stayed closed. Atlas placed one paw near the bottom panel and sniffed. Benny touched Atlas's mustache, then turned toward Pip. Pip approached last. His paw landed on the wooden threshold, so small against the dark grain that Grant felt something inside him give way. He could have carried them back. He could have preserved the room exactly as Loss had arranged it. Instead, he took the brass key from the top drawer of the hallway table. His hand trembled once as he fitted it into the lock. The door opened with a dry whisper. Cedar, old fabric, and the faint medicinal scent of Mac's final months moved into the hallway. Atlas entered first but did not run. He circled the flattened dog bed and lay beside it, his head resting against the worn edge. Benny sat beneath the leash hanging from the wall hook and looked upward when the metal clip shifted softly. Pip approached the overturned bowl beneath the window, startled at his reflection, then curled against its side. Grant remained in the doorway, afraid that stepping inside would make Mac's absence final in a way death had not. Then Benny looked at him. There was no demand in the puppy's face, only quiet attention. Grant crossed the threshold and sat on the floor. The puppies had not replaced Mac. Nothing ever would. They had simply entered the place where Grant's love had become trapped and shown him that memory did not have to remain sealed to remain sacred. Night settled over the orchard. Atlas slept near the old bed, Benny beneath the leash, and Pip beside the bowl. When Grant finally rose, he turned off the hallway light but did not close the door. For the first time in 3 years, Mac's room remained open through the night. Weekend sunlight spread across the fields outside Portland, but a cold spring wind kept slipping beneath the white tents of the adoption fair. 4 days after Grant opened Mac's room, Megan published the adoption profile she had written at his kitchen table. She refused to describe Atlas, Benny, and Pip as damaged, inseparable, or helpless. Instead, she explained that the 8-week-old brothers showed anxiety when divided too suddenly, yet were already learning to eat, sleep, and explore at short distances from one another. The profile included the photograph of Benny balanced between the 2 carriers, one paw reaching toward Atlas and the other toward Pip. Within hours, the image traveled through local rescue groups, neighborhood pages, and church communities across northern Oregon. Some people praised the shelter for protecting the puppy's bond. Others accused Megan of making adoption unnecessarily difficult. One commenter wrote that puppies needed discipline, not emotional stories. Another offered to adopt Atlas alone because he appeared strongest. Grant read that sentence twice before setting his phone face down. Strength, he had learned, was often the quality people admired most when they wanted to ignore what it cost. By Saturday morning, Grant and Megan had driven the puppies to the Portland Spring Adoption Fair. The event occupied a broad grass field bordered by young maples and rows of parked vehicles. Rescue tents stretched from one end to the other, filled with barking dogs, volunteers in bright shirts, families carrying paper cups, and children pleading with parents who had promised they were only looking. Megan, wearing a dark green rescue jacket over jeans, arranged a quiet corner away from the loudest walkway. Grant unfolded a small exercise pen, placed 3 water bowls inside, and spread the blanket the puppies had used at his house. Atlas explored the perimeter first, his half-raised ear bending in the wind. Benny followed, occasionally stopping to check both brothers. Pip remained near Grant's boot until Atlas returned and nudged him forward. For the first hour, people gathered constantly. 3 puppies curled together were nearly impossible to pass without smiling. The difficulty began when Megan explained that the shelter wanted them adopted as a trio. The first serious visitors were Daniel and Melissa Harper, a married couple in their early 30s. Daniel was a lean, clean-shaven man with sandy hair, rectangular glasses, and the cautious politeness of someone who calculated every commitment before making it. Melissa was short and softly built, with curly brown hair, warm olive skin, and tired hazel eyes that brightened whenever Pip moved. They had recently purchased a small house after years of saving, but veterinary costs for their elderly beagle had emptied most of their emergency fund before he died. Melissa held Pip for several minutes while Atlas watched from beside her shoe. When Megan explained the yearly costs of 3 growing German shepherds, Daniel's face tightened with honest regret. "We could give one a good life," he said. "I'm afraid 3 would mean failing all of them." They left without arguing, and Grant respected them for knowing the limits of their kindness. The second family stayed nearly 40 minutes. Rachel Monroe was a tall, fair-skinned woman with straight blonde hair and the alert manner of a schoolteacher accustomed to noticing every child in a room. Her husband, Kevin, had a broad face, a trimmed reddish beard, and a gentle voice that became even softer around animals. Their 2 teenage daughters sat inside the pen while Atlas carried a rope toy between them and Benny climbed clumsily over Kevin's boot. The Monroes had a fenced yard, experience with large dogs, and enough room. For a while, Megan believed they might be the family everyone had been waiting for. Then, Rachel called their landlord. The lease allowed only 2 animals. She asked whether an exception was possible and listened in silence before lowering the phone. Pip had fallen asleep against her daughter's leg. Rachel touched his head once, then stood with the tears gathering in her eyes. "Taking 2 and leaving 1 would feel worse than leaving together," she said. Grant watched the family walk toward the parking area, the girls turning back until the crowd swallowed them. The third rejection was less gentle. Curtis Wade, a heavy-set man in his 50s, approached near mid-afternoon. He had sun-reddened skin, thinning gray hair, a square jaw covered with rough stubble, and the loud confidence of someone accustomed to treating preference as authority. He studied the puppies without kneeling. Atlas stood at the fence, meeting his gaze. "That one," Curtis said. "He's got backbone." Megan explained the adoption conditions. Curtis dismissed Benny as overly dependent and Pip as too nervous for serious training. "Separate the strongest one now," he said. "He'll forget the others in a week." Grant felt anger rise so quickly that his hands went cold. Before he could answer, Atlas looked away from Curtis, crossed the pen, and lay beside the sleeping Pip. Benny settled between them, pressing his back to Atlas and his nose against Pip's shoulder. Grant looked at Curtis. He already made his choice. Curtis muttered something about sentimental people and walked away. By the final hour, the crowd had thinned. Pip slept deeply, exhausted by noise and unfamiliar scents. Benny rested close beside him, while Atlas remained upright despite his drooping eyes watching everyone who approached. That was when Andrew Cole stopped several feet from the pen. He was 49, tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered fair skin, brown hair silvering at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard following the strong angles of his jaw. His gray-green eyes were observant but reserved, and the worn cuffs of his canvas jacket suggested a man more comfortable repairing things than replacing them. He did not whistle or reach through the fence. He lowered himself onto the grass and waited. Atlas noticed him first. Benny lifted his head next. Pip woke only when his brothers moved, then followed them toward the quiet stranger. Andrew asked about vaccinations, food costs, individual training, and whether keeping the puppies together might prevent them from developing confidence. Grant explained that the goal was not lifelong dependence but gradual independence built from safety. Andrew listened without interrupting. He owned a house outside Portland with a fenced yard, worked remotely as an architectural estimator, and had previously cared for an anxious rescue dog for 11 years. He provided his veterinarian's information, photographs of the yard, and a realistic plan for separate training sessions. Then he looked at the 3 puppies gathered around his knees. "I don't think raising 3 puppies will be easy," he said, "but I won't make a family choose who gets to stay." Megan reviewed every document before placing the adoption forms in front of him. Andrew signed for Atlas, Benny, and Pip. When he rose beside Grant with the completed folder in his hand, Megan studied the silver at his temples, the guarded eyes, and the familiar line of his jaw. Her relief gave way to sudden unease. Andrew Cole looked strangely like Richard Langley. A week later, fine rain drifted over Portland, turning Andrew Cole's backyard into a field of silver beads beneath the soft gray morning. During the 7 days since the adoption fair, Andrew had sent Megan a short video every evening. The first showed Atlas racing along the fence after a wind-blown leaf, pausing when Benny disappeared behind the garden shed but waiting instead of charging after him. In the second, Benny slept alone on the wide windowsill while his brothers played across the room. His sable chest rose steadily, and when he woke, he simply looked toward them before resting his head again. Pip's progress came more slowly. The smallest puppy still disliked sudden noises and checked doorways before entering, but by the 6th day, he had walked the length of Andrew's hallway alone, investigated a laundry basket, and returned to his brothers without panic. The 3 still looked back for one another. The difference was that looking had become reassurance rather than desperation. Grant watched each video more than once. He was pleased, yet the quiet house felt heavier after the screen went dark. Caring for them had required patience, ruined socks, interrupted sleep, and constant attention. Losing that noise had revealed how much empty space he had mistaken for peace. Grant and Megan drove to Andrew's home on Sunday afternoon. The rain had softened to mist by the time they reached the quiet neighborhood outside Portland. Andrew's 1-story cedar house stood behind a low stone path, with rosemary growing beside the porch and a fenced backyard visible through an open gate. Andrew answered before they could knock twice. His brown hair, silver at the temples, was slightly disordered, and his neatly trimmed beard could not hide the guarded tension in his jaw. He wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, practical work pants, and the expression of a man still surprised that 3 small lives had trusted him. Atlas arrived first, skidding across the hardwood before pushing his broad head beneath Grant's hand. Benny ran toward Megan, stopped halfway to check Atlas, then continued. Pip remained near Andrew's ankle for 3 cautious seconds before gathering enough courage to cross the room on his own. Grant crouched and allowed Pip to approach without reaching. When the puppy finally rested one paw on Grant's knee, something warm and painful moved through him. They remembered him, but they no longer needed him to feel safe. That was the outcome he had fought for, even if part of him had not prepared for the loneliness of succeeding. Andrew had arranged the house with careful intelligence rather than sentiment. 3 beds stood in separate corners of the living room, close enough for the puppies to see one another. Baby gates divided safe areas from the kitchen and stairs. Training notes were clipped to the refrigerator, listing individual feeding times, short solo sessions, and the reactions of each puppy to distance. Atlas was learning to wait before crossing doors. Benny could remain alone with a chew toy for nearly 5 minutes. Pip had begun eating even when one brother left the room. "You're giving them room to become themselves," Grant said. Andrew looked toward the puppies. I know what happens when people decide separation and independence are the same thing. Megan heard the weight beneath the sentence. She sat across from Andrew at the dining table while Grant remained near the window, where Atlas and Benny wrestled on the rug and Pip explored beneath a chair. Megan asked gently why Andrew had stayed at the fair when so many others had walked away. Andrew wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. His gray-green eyes settled on the rain moving down the glass. I had a twin brother, he said. Their father had died in a logging accident 3 months before the boys were born. He had been a tall, dark-haired man with a square face and a reputation for helping neighbors before tending to his own needs. But Andrew knew him only through a few faded photographs. Their mother had been 26 when she gave birth, a slender woman with chestnut hair, pale, freckled skin, and a stubborn gentleness that poverty slowly wore down. She cleaned motel rooms during the day and washed restaurant linens at night. For 5 years, she kept both boys fed through borrowed money, church donations, and exhaustion. Then, an untreated infection damaged her heart. Medical bills arrived faster than wages, and the landlord threatened eviction. A childless couple from another county offered to adopt one boy. Andrew remembered little of the day except a brown suitcase, his brother's red sweater, and their mother kneeling between them while trying not to cry. Andrew stayed. His twin was taken away. Their mother recovered enough to work again, but never forgave herself. She died when Andrew was 19, leaving behind a small envelope containing the name his brother had been given at birth, Richard Cole. Andrew spent the next 30 years searching. Adoption records were sealed. The hospital had changed ownership. A county archive fire destroyed several files. Each new lead ended with a closed office, a dead telephone number, or someone explaining privacy laws in a voice trained not to carry hope. Andrew had learned to appear calm because hope embarrassed him when it failed. The 3 puppies had reminded him of the final moment he remembered clearly. His brother reaching from the back seat of a car while Andrew stood in the road reaching back. When that man wanted Atlas and dismissed the other 2, Andrew said, I heard someone deciding again which part of a family was worth keeping. Megan's fingers tightened around her cup. She could see Richard's face inside Andrew's now. The same angular jaw, the same guarded eyes, the same habit of controlling emotion until it hardened into policy. She refused to reveal private employment or adoption information. Instead, she said carefully, I know a man named Richard. He is 49. He was adopted when he was young, and he resembles you enough that I noticed it before you left the fair. Andrew went motionless. Grant watched Hope enter the room like a frightened animal, too fragile to approach directly. Megan offered to pass Andrew's contact details to Richard and allow him to decide what came next. At Columbia Gorge Animal Rescue that evening, Richard sat alone in his office after the kennel lights had dimmed. Megan's message remained unopened on his computer while a cardboard box rested on the desk. His adoptive parents had left it to him years earlier, and he had never examined the papers beneath the family photographs. Richard lifted out an old envelope. Inside was an original birth certificate bearing the name Richard Cole, the Portland hospital where he had been born, and a birth date identical to the one Megan had provided for Andrew. His phone began to ring. Andrew Cole appeared on the screen. Richard held the birth certificate in one hand and watched the name flash until the call ended. Golden evening light settled across Andrew Cole's porch while the final rain clouds drifted east toward the Cascade Range. The DNA results had arrived 4 days earlier, printed in language so clinical that it seemed almost cruel. A greater than 99.9% probability that Andrew Cole and Richard Langley were identical twin brothers. Andrew read the page standing in his kitchen while Atlas slept beneath the table. Benny watched rain slide down the window, and Pip worried the corner of a braided rope toy. For more than 30 years, Andrew had imagined receiving proof like this. In those private rehearsals, relief always came first. Instead, he felt joy tangled with anger, grief, and fear that the brother he had finally found might still choose to remain missing. Richard received the same result in his office at Columbia Gorge Animal Rescue. He folded the paper twice, placed it beneath a stack of intake reports, and continued working as though blood could be buried under paperwork. He delayed Andrew's calls, then answered only through brief messages. He said he needed time. What he meant was that the truth had removed the story he had used to survive. Richard had spent most of his life believing attachment was dangerous because anything loved deeply enough could be taken away. His adoptive parents had been decent people, but they had valued composure and discouraged questions about the family that came before them. Whenever Richard asked about his childhood, his adoptive father reminded him that looking backward was ungrateful. Over time, Richard transformed that lesson into discipline. He trusted schedules, contracts, separate files, and decisions that left no room for longing. Families, he told himself, did not need to remain together in order to endure. Yet Atlas, Benny, and Pip had revealed the weakness in that belief. Their fear had offended him because it resembled his own. Their refusal to accept separation made the 5-year-old boy inside him feel less foolish for still remembering a hand reaching from beside him. Megan found Richard alone in the shelter's supply room late Thursday afternoon. He stood between stacked food bags and folded blankets, his brown and silver hair less orderly than usual, and a day's gray stubble roughening his narrow jaw. Without the clipboard against his chest, he seemed older and less protected. "I thought separating them would make them stronger," he admitted. Megan did not rescue him from the silence that followed. Richard stared at the concrete floor. "The truth is, I needed it to be true. If they could forget each other, then maybe I should have been able to forget him." Megan reminded him that Andrew had not asked for an explanation or forgiveness. He had asked only for one meeting. Richard gave a bitter breath. "He spent his life trying to find me." His hazel eyes lifted, stripped of their usual authority. "I spent mine making sure no one could." On Saturday, Richard finally drove to Andrew's house. He parked across the street and remained behind the wheel long enough for the evening sun to move from the windshield to the hood. His hands rested at 10 and 2, as if he were waiting for permission to proceed. Through the front window, he saw Andrew cross the living room with the familiar broad-shouldered gait Richard had noticed at the adoption fair but refused to examine. Seeing his own movements inside another man's body made the truth feel more intimate than the DNA report. Richard nearly started the engine. Then Pip appeared at the window, pale paws against the glass, and stared toward the unfamiliar car. The smallest puppy no longer hid when something frightened him. He studied it first. Richard turned off the ignition. Andrew opened the door before Richard reached the porch. The two men stood several feet apart in the amber light. Their resemblance was unmistakable now. The same strong line through the jaw, the same guarded gray-green eyes, the same silver beginning at the temples. Andrew wore a faded denim shirt and work boots, while Richard had arrived in his neat charcoal sweater and clean brown shoes, dressed as though formality might protect him from becoming someone's brother. Neither man raised his arms. A handshake seemed absurd. An embrace seemed impossible. Andrew's mouth moved before sound came. "You came." Richard nodded, unable to trust anything more. Behind Andrew, puppy claws tapped across the floor. Atlas burst through the doorway and stopped beside Andrew's leg, alert but not aggressive. Benny followed more slowly, his sable coat catching gold beneath the porch light. He studied Richard, then approached with his head lowered and placed one paw on the toe of Richard's shoe. Richard's breath caught. Pip remained at the doorway. Weeks earlier, the little puppy would have retreated behind both brothers. Instead, he stepped onto the porch alone. He walked into the space between the two men, turned once, and lay down lengthwise across the boards. His head rested against Andrew's boot, while his tail touched Richard's shoe. Atlas lowered himself beside Andrew. Benny settled near Richard, completing a small living bridge. Andrew looked down at the puppies before meeting Richard's eyes. "I searched for you," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, which somehow made the words harder to bear. Richard swallowed. "I know. I wondered whether you remembered me." Richard's fingers curled against his palm. He remembered the red sweater Andrew had described, but from the opposite side. He remembered their mother crying beside the car. He remembered a smaller hand slipping from his own as an unfamiliar woman pulled him toward the back seat. Most of all, he remembered looking through the glass and seeing Andrew grow smaller in the road. "I remembered enough to spend my whole life trying not to be found," Richard said. Andrew's expression tightened, but he did not demand an apology. More than 40 years could not be repaired by one correct sentence. Richard stepped onto the first porch stair. Andrew shifted to one side of the bench, leaving an open place beside him. After a long hesitation, Richard sat. Atlas moved closer to Andrew's knee. Benny leaned against Richard's ankle. Pip remained stretched between them, no longer trembling. The brothers did not embrace or promise to recover every lost year. They simply stayed. As daylight faded over the wet Portland streets, Andrew placed one hand on Atlas's back and Richard rested his hand on Benny and Pip, the three puppies who had refused to let separation become the final word. Early summer brought warm sunlight to Hood River, and white apple blossoms surrounded the wooden house that had once seemed determined to remain silent. 6 weeks had passed since Richard Langley first sat beside Andrew Cole on the porch, and change had arrived without ceremony. At Columbia Gorge Animal Rescue, Richard replaced the old intake policy with 4 new requirements. Animals showing signs of unusual attachment could no longer be separated merely to create faster adoption listings. Staff had to document behavior before making placement decisions. Profiles had to describe real emotional and physical needs. Shared foster homes could be sought for connected animals, and progress toward independence had to be encouraged gradually rather than forced through fear. The changes occupied less than a page in the shelter manual, yet Richard read every sentence twice before signing. He knew a rule could never return the childhood stolen from him and Andrew, but it might stop another living creature from learning that love was a weakness to be punished. Megan watched him place the signed policy in the staff binder. He still wore his gray-brown hair neatly combed and carried his clipboard with the same precise posture, but the hardness around his hazel eyes had begun to ease. He listened longer before answering, and when volunteers disagreed with him, he no longer treated every question as a challenge to his authority. Richard and Andrew did not attempt to recover more than 40 lost years within a few emotional conversations. Their relationship grew through ordinary tasks that placed no demand on memory. Andrew brought coffee to the shelter on Wednesday mornings. Richard visited on Sundays and helped repair a loose section of backyard fence while Andrew held the boards steady. They studied old photographs without forcing each image to reveal something it could not. Sometimes they spoke about their mother. Sometimes they discussed weather, rising lumber prices, or the proper way to sharpen a mower blade. They were learning that silence could mean comfort instead of abandonment. Atlas, Benny, and Pip changed alongside them. Atlas had grown broader through the chest, and both ears now stood upright, giving him the proud appearance of a guard dog despite his clumsy puppy feet. He could wander alone beneath the backyard trees, investigate a new scent, and remain calm even when his brothers disappeared behind the shed. Benny's sable coat had deepened into warm brown and black, while the white patch beneath his chin remained like a small question mark. He no longer felt compelled to stand between his brothers every time they rested. Some afternoons, he slept alone near the open window, trusting that the others would still exist when he woke. Pip remained the smallest, with pale tan legs, bright brown eyes, and ears still slightly too large for his narrow face. But the puppy who once flattened himself against a kennel floor now became the first to greet visitors. He approached carefully, sniffed one shoe, then wagged with his entire body as though bravery had been waiting inside him for permission. The brothers still checked on one another. Atlas would pause at the far side of the yard and glance toward the porch. Benny lifted his head whenever one brother entered another room. Pip sometimes returned from an independent adventure just to touch noses with both of them. Yet, those gestures no longer came from terror. Their bond had widened enough to hold distance without interpreting it as loss. Grant understood their progress because something similar was happening inside his own house. Mac's room remained open every day. Grant removed the medical supplies and folded the final blanket into a cedar chest, but he left Mac's faded collar hanging on the wall. Beneath it, he placed 3 clean beds for frightened dogs that needed temporary shelter before entering the larger rescue system. The room did not become a memorial or a replacement for the companion Grant had lost. It became a place where fear could rest without being hurried. On the first evening Grant prepared it, he stood in the doorway expecting guilt. Instead, he felt the quiet approval of a memory no longer trapped behind a lock. The rescue center held its early summer fundraiser in an orchard outside Hood River. Long tables stood beneath strings of lights, volunteers served lemonade and pie, and families gathered between rows of white blossoms. Grant stayed near the edge of the crowd, still more comfortable observing than being thanked. Megan moved between the tables with her auburn hair tied back, speaking with the easy confidence of someone who had finally seen honesty become policy. Richard and Andrew arrived together. They did not announce themselves as reunited brothers. They simply walked side by side, carrying 3 leashes. Atlas leaned against Andrew's leg whenever someone stopped to ask about him. Benny sat beside Richard, occasionally resting one paw on his polished shoe. Pip traveled between both men, looping his leash around their ankles until they were forced to step closer and untangle themselves. Richard laughed when Andrew accused Pip of conducting family therapy without a license. It was a small, awkward laugh, but it carried farther than either man expected. Near sunset, Andrew released the puppies inside a fenced section of the orchard. Atlas ran first. Benny followed a separate trail between the trees, and Pip chased a drifting blossom before realizing it was not alive. The 3 spread farther apart than they ever had beneath the abandoned shed, yet each eventually stopped and looked back. They found one another across the grass, then continued running without fear. Grant watched them beneath the white branches. Mac's loss remained inside him, but it no longer demanded that every door stay closed. Healing had not asked him to forget. It had asked him to make room. As Atlas, Benny, and Pip raced back toward Andrew and Richard, Grant understood that sometimes love did not arrive to replace what had been lost. Sometimes it simply waited outside until a grieving heart finally unlocked the door. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, signs, or answers. Sometimes they come quietly, through 3 puppies, an open door, or a brother who never stopped searching. Atlas, Benny, and Pip remind us that healing does not mean forgetting those we have lost. It means allowing love to enter the empty places grief guarded. In life, we may never know who is struggling behind a calm face, who needs a hand, or who is waiting for someone to look back. A kindness, a conversation, or one brave step toward forgiveness can become the miracle another person prayed for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about the person or animal who changed your life and subscribe to support more stories like this. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep every door in your heart open to love.